Hello and welcome to The Discussion. This channel is here to serve as a platform for scholarly discussions about some of the most significant questions regarding the history of early Christianity, the philosophy of religion, and systematic theology. My name is Nahoa, and I'm here to ask those questions, to seek truth openly and critically, and to share the journey with you. This first season is centered around the history of early Christianity, and especially the question of Jesus' resurrection. Now, when we look at the Gospels, the resurrection narratives agree on a number of things, and this is a point of interest for sure to see the common elements of various traditions. But we can clearly see differences between the accounts. So, what are we to make of them? Are they adaptations, contradictions? How are we even to approach this topic, and what are the implications of our approach? These are some of the questions we'll get into today, and the scholar joining and teaching us earned his master's in religious studies from Liberty University and his PhD in New Testament from the University of Pretoria. He has debated a number of times and written a number of books, his most recent being Why Are There Differences in the Gospels? What We Can Learn from Ancient Biography. He is a prominent historian and apologist, someone whose work has been part of my journey from the beginning. So, without further introduction, Dr. Michael Licona. How are you?
Well, good. Noah, it's wonderful to be with you. Thanks for inviting me on.
Yeah, honestly, I am honored to have you on, and I'm really excited to ask you some questions. Normally for these discussions, I start off by asking preliminary questions about the significance of the topic and the implications of your approach. But for this one in particular, I think it would be best to start with specific examples so that our later discussion of the implications can be contextualized. So,
Okay.
is that all right?
Sure.
All right, great. So my first question and the first difference I want to point to has to do with a difference in chronology between John and Matthew. So when I was studying the guard story in Matthew, I noticed this sort of difference, and then Dr. Raymond Brown, in his The Death of the Messiah, also mentioned it, and he views it as the strongest objection to the guard story and details in Matthew. So I'm curious to hear what you have to say about this. And the difference goes something like this. In John, the first event, in John chapter 20 specifically, the first event is that the women, including Mary Magdalene, discover the empty tomb. Then they tell the male disciples that they've discovered the empty tomb. Then an angel appears to Mary. Then Jesus appears to Mary, and Jesus explicitly reveals that he is Jesus and that he has been raised. And then the women tell the male disciples again, but this time about the resurrection and the postmortem appearance. In Matthew, not only is the account shorter, but you have the women discovering the empty tomb while they see an appearance of the angel, because on the most natural reading of Matthew, the women as well as the guards are witnessing angels coming down from heaven and rolling away the stone. Then it's the angels that explicitly reveal the resurrection, saying, "Why do you seek the living among the dead? He is not here, he is risen." Then they see Jesus, and then they tell the male disciples about the resurrection. So they agree on a lot of the same events, but they place it in a different order. So what are we to make of this?
Well, I think that the gospel authors are doing throughout the gospels and even here, especially in the resurrection narratives, exactly the kind of stuff that we find typical of ancient biographers of that era. So you could see observe the same kind of stuff occurring in the accounts, various accounts of the assassination of Julius Caesar. That event is reported by Appian, Cicero, Dio, Livy, Nicolaus, Plutarch, Suetonius, and Velleius. And you'll find every bit as many differences in the details and to the extent of which those differences occur, you'll find within those accounts. And yet no one turns around and says, well, Caesar must not have been assassinated, or we can call that into question. There is a core account of what happened, and then there are some variations in some of the peripheral details. And that's what we find in the resurrection narratives. Now, it is true, Matthew's account and John's account differ some, and Matthew's account is shorter. Now, that is typical of Matthew. Matthew, throughout his gospel, on several occasions, he tends to abbreviate quite a bit, simplifying his story. So we would expect that with the empty tomb narratives, the resurrection narratives. Now, there are two differences in the resurrection accounts that I think are very difficult to resolve. All the rest of them, I think, are quite easy and reasonably, plausibly resolved by just taking into consideration the use of compositional devices, which were prescribed in the compositional textbooks by people like Theon and Quintilian in the first century. Theon writing in Greek, Quintilian writing in Latin, and that we also see exercised or illustrated when Plutarch tells the same story in multiple biographies that he wrote. When the same story is told, like, for example, the assassination of Julius Caesar. How is it told differently in his biography of Caesar from his biography of Brutus or of Antony? So we see it told in different ways with different details involved. Again, they're all in the peripheral details, but here it's not four different authors. It's the same author using the same sources, writing for the most part at the same time, and yet his accounts have slight differences. And I think that these are best accounted for by the use of compositional devices. So, yeah, that's how I would look at that. I think what Matthew is doing, the two that we have that are difficult to reconcile, even with these compositional devices, at least that I would think it's not clearly reconciled in that way, would be the timing and location of Jesus's appearance to Mary Magdalene after rising from the dead. And the second one would be the first appearance to the group of male disciples. Was it in Jerusalem or was it in Galilee? These are very difficult. And they still leave me a little bit bewildered. I think when it comes to the appearance of Jesus to Mary Magdalene, I think just like Matthew simplifies and compresses throughout his gospel on numerous occasions, he's probably done that here. So rather than narrating two trips to the tomb, as John has it, he just has one. And so he conflates the two. And then he has to place the appearance to Mary somewhere, so he just drops it in as they're running back after they've spoken with the angels. That's where Jesus meets Mary Magdalene. So I think it's just to simplify the account.
So would you say that John's account is maybe closer to truth and Matthew is compressing and also utilizing the device of synthetic chronological placement or displacement?
Yeah, I think Matthew is using the synthetic chronological placement there. But I would also say that I think if I had to guess, and we can't know for sure, but if I had to guess, I'd say if we could go back in a time machine and watch it happen, it would be more like what is narrated in John. But if we recognize that Matthew is simplifying the account, then, it's truthful. It's just not truthful in the same kind of photographic sense as I would say it. It's kind of like the difference. Those of us who are married understand what I mean when I say there's the way a guy tells a story and the way a girl tells a story. Girls like a lot of details. They want those details very specific. They want them precise. Guys, in many cases, they just don't care. They're a little more lax with the details. They will not get into as many. They will eliminate, they will bend the details a little bit in order to avoid having to talk for 5 more minutes to give some background knowledge that their listener could care less about. So I think it's just different ways of telling the story.
All right, so that was kind of, that question included the first one that you say kind of leaves us bewildered. And the other one is whether the appearances take place in Jerusalem or Galilee. So in the Gospel of Luke, when Jesus rises from the dead, he appears to people in Jerusalem. He explicitly tells them, do not leave the city until I've ascended. And then in the book of Acts, he ascends in Bethany, which is in Jerusalem. So in Luke, it's explicitly and exclusively in Jerusalem, while in Mark and Matthew, the appearances take place in Galilee. It's not as exclusive, but it still seems like there's a contradiction, dare I use that word? And then John, interestingly, has an appearance in Jerusalem, and then in John 21, by the Sea of Galilee. So, I know you say this is kind of perplexing, but still, what's your take on this?
That's a very difficult one. I don't really know the answer to it, Noah. I would say that I fluctuate. Sometimes I think that if we'd been there, the first appearance would have occurred in Jerusalem. Other times I think if we'd been there, the first appearance to the group of male disciples we would have seen it in Galilee. So I fluctuate back and forth. Right now, I might lean toward Jerusalem today. Tomorrow, I might say Galilee. Um, I think when we're looking at Luke, the Gospel of Luke, he narrates everything happening in Jerusalem. So the resurrection, all the appearances, and the ascension happens on Easter in Jerusalem. And because it's all happening on one day, he's got to have it all in Jerusalem. Now, what's clear here is that Luke is compressing the account. He's compressing everything to occur on Easter. It's not an error due to a lack of him being a sharp historian. It's intentional on his part. Why do we know this? Because in his sequel, the book of Acts, chapter 1, verse 3, he says that Jesus appeared to them over a period of 40 days. So Luke has certainly compressed the account. Why he has done that? Well, we can't get into a time machine and go back and ask him. But if I had to guess, it's because the church is headquartered in Jerusalem, and that's where he wants to draw attention. Everything is coming out from Jerusalem. The Judaism was headquartered. It was the seat of Judaism was the seat of Judaism was in Jerusalem. The seat of Christianity was in Jerusalem, and maybe that's why Luke is drawing all his attention there. It could be because usually a biography was fit on a single scroll. It was between 10 and 25,000 words. Luke's gospel is the longest of the four. He's at 24,000 in some Greek words. So maybe he recognizes he's running out of space and he needs to just abbreviate things. So he puts it all in Jerusalem. I don't know. Again, we can only guess. But he's certainly doing it intentionally. But that doesn't get rid of the challenge or of the tension here, because Matthew certainly has the first appearance to the male disciples in Galilee. And in Mark, it's even implied. So in Mark chapter 14, verse 28, Jesus tells the disciples that after he has been raised from the dead, he will go ahead of them to Galilee, and there they will see him. And so the angel in chapter 16, verse 7 of Mark says, go tell the disciples and Peter that he has gone ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. So the first appearance to the male disciples is certainly predicted or implied by Mark, who doesn't narrate appearances of Jesus for one reason or another. I think my inclination is that the ending of Mark was either lost or Mark was unable to complete it. A number of other scholars think that Mark intended to end at chapter 16, verse 8, but there's no agreement on why he would have ended it there. So because Mark doesn't have he doesn't narrate any post-resurrection appearances of Jesus, we really can't comment there. But he seems to place it. He knows of one that's going to take place in Galilee, the first one, because Jesus is already headed there. And then there's an emphasis in the clause, there you will see him just as he told you. In Greek, there's an emphasis on that noun. There, in Galilee, is where you will see him as he told you. So why the change? I don't know. I do think that one of them changed it intentionally. I can only guess if Matthew or Mark changed it, it would have been because maybe the bulk of Jesus's ministry was in Galilee. It's only a guess, but again, these differences in the accounts are in the peripheral details. Whether he appeared to the group of male disciples first in Jerusalem or in Galilee, I don't know. It was in one or the other, that's for sure. I think to try to harmonize them does not work well. I think that's the wrong path. We have to recognize that someone has changed it. It's either an error or they did it intentionally for another reason. And I think it's the latter of those two. But even if it were an error, that doesn't detract from the fact that, or the claim that he appeared to them after his resurrection. He died on Sunday morning. Some women went to the tomb. They found it empty. An angel told them that he had been raised. And then he appears to them in individual and in group settings. He appears to the women, then he appears to the group of male disciples. That is a core that goes throughout all of the Gospels. And you just don't dismiss an account because there are some differences. Just one more thing I'll say here is when the Titanic sank, some of its survivors said the Titanic broke in half and sank. And then others said, no, it went down in one piece. But no one turned around and said, well, these eyewitnesses who survived it contradicted one another. So how can we know for sure whether the Titanic sank? They just said, well, we know the basic of what happened here, but some of the peripheral details, we're just going to have to say we can't determine what happened.
I think that's helpful. This leads me to kind of another but still relevant question. And you hinted at it. Do you think it's plausible, or maybe comparably plausible to the compositional device theory, that Matthew and Mark are using one historical tradition and Luke is using a different historical tradition, and so of course one of them is getting it wrong, right? In that scenario, but so it would be an error, but there's utilizing different historical traditions instead of one of them purposefully, altering the location. Why do you think one of them is more plausible than the other?
Yeah, hey, I appreciate the question, Noah, and the fact is it shows that you are reading on this, and I applaud you for it. I mean, that's an informed question you're asking. No, I don't think that these are two separate historical traditions, and I'll tell you why. Are two conflicting historical traditions. The early church reports that Mark received his information from the Apostle Peter. He got the bulk of his information from the Apostle Peter. This is reported as early as sometime in the early 2nd century by Papias, who probably got his information from either one of the apostles or one of their colleagues who traveled with them, and that they would have received this information sometime in the latter part of the 1st century. So that, I think, is a pretty reliable tradition. So it's pretty good. The evidence that we have for the traditional authorship of the Gospels, though not unimpeachable, is better. It's superior to the authorship we have for something like Plutarch's Lives. And no classicist of which I'm aware would question whether Plutarch wrote the 48 biographies that have survived, attributed to him. And like I said, the evidence, the external evidence we have for the traditionalship of the authors is better than what we have for Plutarch's Lives. The majority of critical New Testament scholars writing in English since 1965 favor the traditional authorship of Mark, and that Mark got his information from Peter. How do I know this? Because I supervised a master's thesis written by one of my students, Joshua Pelletier, who's currently doing his PhD work on the same subject, though expanding it. And he surveyed more than 200 critical New Testament scholars from 1965 through, I think it was 2019, and did an actual bean count. And those who commented on the authorship of Mark, that's the conclusion to which the majority came. The traditional authorship is correct, and that Mark got his information primarily from Peter. So that's eyewitness testimony. When it comes to the authorship of John's gospel, most critical scholars today think that John is writing independently of Mark. He may have been aware of Mark, but he's still writing independently of Mark. And the majority of critical scholars, while not acknowledging the traditional authorship of John's gospel as being written by John, the son of Zebedee, one of Jesus' 3 closest disciples, they still think that either it was written by one of Jesus' minor disciples, or whoever wrote it used one of Jesus's disciples as their primary source. So you still have it closely rooted in eyewitness testimony. So no, I don't think they are relying on two separate traditions that differ from one another. I think that one of them has changed it intentionally for whatever reasons that they had. They're using compositional devices, and they may have wanted to put an emphasis either on Jerusalem or Galilee, and that's why you have that going on.
I think that's helpful. And like you said, these previous two, while they are, bewildering, they're in the peripheral details. They're not sort of in the core of the narrative. So my next and last question about a specific example of a difference has to do with something that I feel like is a little more substantial. It has to do with the development the development of the accounts. So in Mark, you have a pretty bare, empty tomb narrative with an indication of a future postmortem appearance in chapter 16, verse 7. And then, the gospel ends, or maybe we lost the gospel, or the real ending. Then Matthew has a more grand discovery of the empty tomb, and then you have multiple postmortem appearances. In Luke, you have the empty tomb, postmortem appearances, as well as another one to the Emmaus disciples, and it's very clear that Jesus is robustly physical because he eats fish with them and he invites them to touch his side. And then in John, not only do you have 2 whole chapters about the resurrection, but you also have the doubting Thomas incident. And in John 21, there's a postmortem appearance by the Sea of Galilee that involves a nature miracle. So you go from sort of bare, empty tomb with indication of postmortem appearance to the doubting Thomas episode and miraculous postmortem appearances. So while this isn't technically a contradiction, it does seem like there might be a progression of sorts. And you've said in your big book on the resurrection, a new historiographical approach, that we can be very confident that there were postmortem appearances, there were resurrection experiences, but when it comes to particular incidents, like did the Emmaus disciples really see Jesus and then he vanished while they were breaking bread, or did doubting Thomas, or did unbelieving Thomas really touch the side of Jesus? When it comes to those, as historians, we can't be as sure. So what do you think Matthew, Luke, and John were doing? Did they just have information that was unknown to Mark? Were they filling in where they thought they should have filled in, or extrapolated from things that are indicated in Mark? Just what are we to make of this sort of development?
Well, good question once again, Noah. I'd say not just Luke or John have Jesus as being robustly physical. All of them have the risen Jesus as being robustly physical. So all 4 Gospels talk about an empty tomb. Jesus' corpse has been raised. That's physical resurrection. Now, from there, we have to leave out Mark because he doesn't narrate an appearance. So we can only talk about Matthew, Luke, and John going forward. In Matthew, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, when they meet Jesus, they grab his feet and he has to say, "Stop clinging to me." That's robustly physical. In Luke, Jesus offers his disciples the opportunity to touch him. He eats fish in front of them. And then he says, "A spirit does not have flesh and bone, as you see that I have." That's robustly physical. In John's gospel, you have Jesus offering Thomas to touch him. And then later on, he cooks a meal and feeds his disciples there at the Sea of Galilee, robustly physical. So I don't see any development there in terms of the physicality of Jesus. And now I'm looking at, it looks like my picture might be freezing up a little bit, but I'll just keep going. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you. It was just a little bit, but you're fine.
Okay.
You're fine.
All right, sorry. Now, when it comes to, let's see, what was the other thing? You said the physicality. Oh, the doubting. So doubting is in all the Gospels. Now, not necessarily Mark because he doesn't have the appearance. What happens in Matthew? Chapter 28, verse 17. They go to Galilee. Some worshipped him, but others doubted. In Luke's Gospel, chapter 24, I think it's around... I don't know, in 36, 38, 39, something like that. He says, it says, out of fear, out of joy and amazement, they were unbelieving. Apistos is the Greek word used there. It's even stronger than doubting. Out of joy and amazement, they were unbelieving. And then in John's gospel, you do have doubting Thomas. But remember, as far as we know, when the women in Luke's gospel, when the women came back and said they saw the empty tomb and the angel said he had been raised, Luke reports that the disciples thought they were telling frivolous tales. So they were doubting. So I don't see a development here. They're doubting in all 3 of them. Now, it is important to recognize that in Matthew's gospel, when he says some worshiped him but others doubted, that he uses the word distazo, which means to think two things. It's used one other time in Matthew's gospel, and that's where Peter is walking on water and to Jesus, and he begins to see the waves and the wind, and he's thinking to himself two different things. Wow, this is really cool, but how am I doing this? If I sink, I'm going to drown. And so, thinking these two things, he's doubting. So when he sinks and he asks Jesus to save him, Jesus pulls him up and he says, why did you doubt? Why did you think two things? I think that Luke is communicating the very same thing in his account when he says, out of joy and amazement, they were unbelieving. Well, wait a minute. They're feeling joy and amazement. What do you mean they're unbelieving at this point? Well, of course, they're not without belief, which that Greek term literally means. But I think that it is referring to it in the same sense that we would talk about like a walk-off home run in Game 7, bottom of the ninth inning of the World Series. You think your team's going to lose, and then all of a sudden, click, and the ball goes over the fence, your team wins, and you're saying, unbelievable. That's what we're looking at here. They saw the worst thing, the darkest night of their life, when Jesus was crucified on Friday, and now the best thing that could possibly happen, they see their friend, their Lord, their teacher, alive and in perfect health, having been raised from the dead. And that's how Luke can say, out of joy and amazement, they were unbelieving. So again, I see doubt, and I see, what was the other thing? Whatever it was, you mentioned two things. I don't see development going on here. I think those skeptics who bring up these things and want to see development, they're being pretty select in what they're looking at in those gospels.
That's very interesting. So you don't see major development in the canonical gospels at all, because
I don't.
they are Jesus is substantially reliable in all of them. In Matthew, you're right. The women touch his feet, and he says, "Stop clinging to me." And even in Mark, I mean, the empty tomb implies that he has been resurrected bodily, and then the doubt motif is there throughout. So yeah, I'll have to think about that a lot more. Does
Let me
this
say
mean
one
that
other thing here.
Yeah, go ahead.
And even in Paul's writing, and he may have been writing before even our first gospel, Mark, Paul's pretty clear that resurrection is a physical event. But he approaches it differently. He talks about our resurrection and says our resurrection will be like Jesus's resurrection. And then he goes on to explain the resurrection of our bodies as being a physical event that occurs to our corpse. So Paul is envisioning Jesus's resurrection as a bodily, physical event that happened to his corpse.
Yeah, and that I could have a whole discussion about that, because a number of scholars, such as I think Dr. Garrett Ludeman, Dale Martin, Adela Yarbrough Collins, they would say that the resurrection body in 1 Corinthians 15 indicates it's not continuous, right? And so the body that is buried is different from the very spiritual body, right? Because flesh and blood can't inherit the kingdom of God. But while you, in your massive book on the resurrection, you've argued against this, and Dr. James Ware has a really good article about the use of the term agero, raised, in 1 Corinthians 15. So I can put links to all that in the description so that our audience can check that out if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, I just think that those scholars that you mentioned who want to talk about a spiritual resurrection, I just think that they're wrong on this. And I think I show that in my book. The way that they interpret 1 Corinthians 15 is no longer sustainable. It's unfortunate, as Richard Hayes and I think his name was Alan Siegel, a non-believer. I think he was an agnostic, and then Richard Hayes, a Christian who teaches at Duke. They both say such a translation to call it physical versus spiritual, to contrast the two, is unfortunate. There are numerous reasons to reject such an interpretation, which I explain in my book.
And so we were talking about the development of the resurrection narratives. Does this mean you think, or the lack thereof, Does this mean you think that the appearance to the Emmaus disciples and the appearance to doubting Thomas and the breaking of bread in Luke 24, that we can place our confidence in these events? Or do you think there's still reason
Well,
for doubt?
well, I some things are better attested than others, okay? That's just the nature of how history works. And it's not unique to the Gospels, it's the way it works for all of ancient history. And like I said at the beginning of this program, the same kind of stuff that we find in the Gospels in terms of surface differences, we find the same stuff throughout the Greco-Roman and Jewish literature. Josephus says he's not going to change anything, he's not going to add or subtract anything, and yet he goes on to add, subtract, and change. I think he's just talking about the essence of the story. We can compare what how Josephus, what he says happens and how he quotes scripture. And we see that Matthew and Luke stay closer to Mark's account, which they use as a source, than Josephus does even to scripture. We see Philo, another Jewish writer of the first century, who wrote closer to the time of Jesus. We can see him changing things in scripture, like the order of the 10 plagues to Egypt. He talks about them in a chronological order, and yet they differ from what we find in the scripture. So we're not seeing anything in the Gospels that differs from what other ancient Jewish, Greek, and Roman historians did when reporting their accounts. Now, when it comes to something like the Emmaus disciples, you have had a number of New Testament scholars say, well, Luke invented this because Jesus' breaking and distribution of the bread is to remind us of the Eucharist, Jesus giving the Last Supper. I don't see that. The Last Supper, this Eucharist, involved not only bread, but also wine. There's no wine when Jesus is there with the Emmaus disciples. Moreover, what does it say in Luke's gospel? He gave thanks to God, and then he broke and distributed the bread. Well, guess what? That's exactly what Jesus does when he feeds the 5,000. He gives thanks to God, he breaks the bread, and then distributes it. So why isn't anyone saying, well, this is to remind us of the feeding of the 5,000? Well, because it doesn't really fit in the text. The fact is that back then, a Jew, before any meal, is going to give thanks for the food, and then they're going to break the bread, and they're going to distribute it and eat. So I don't think that there's any kind of necessary theological flavoring here. Maybe Luke gives it some flavoring in that sense, possibly. But if he does, that doesn't mean that the event itself didn't occur. Sometimes, like Matthew, he gives some theological flavoring to the Sermon on the Mount, where he changes the location from the plain, as Luke has it, to the top of the mount. And why does he do this? Well, a lot of New Testament scholars say it's theologically symbolic, that Matthew's kind of showing Jesus here as a new Moses, that as Moses received the law of God at the top of the mount, Jesus is interpreting the law at the top of the mount. So it's a literary and theological move that he's making here, an artistic one as well. So did the Sermon on the Mount happen? Yep. Did it happen on the plain or at the top of the mountain? Well, probably on the plain. And by the way, I've been to Jerusalem twice. I memorized the Sermon on the Mount as Matthew has it, and I have said it, recounted it publicly at the traditional location and at another location. I think it may have occurred. I could tell you it happened at neither of those places because the acoustics are absolutely horrible. So hundreds of people could not have heard it there because of the acoustics. It makes a lot more sense that it would have happened on a plain, that people would have been sitting on the hill. If it were shaped like a natural amphitheater, then Jesus' voice could have easily been heard. So is there artistic flavoring? Yeah. But does it mean that event didn't happen? No.
All right, so those are, we've gone on for 30 minutes or so about 3 specific examples, and I love that. So now we're going to get into kind of clarifying the approach and the implications of that approach. So
Okay.
you make many appeals to compositional devices, and aspects of your approach to gospel differences and reliability have confused some skeptical scholars, such as Dr. Bart Ehrman and concerned some Christian scholars such as Dr. Lydia McGrew in her book, The Mirror of the Mask, which is basically a response to your book, and I know you responded on your YouTube channel. So let me try to encapsulate your perspective, and then you can affirm or correct my synthesis, as well as bring even more clarity to the discussion. So here we go. Modern standards of historiography are different from ancient standards. By modern standards, the Gospels are not robustly reliable, but it is unreasonable or unsuitable to assess the Gospels by modern standards because, as you say in your book, quote, the evangelists, no different than Plutarch and other ancient authors, had no objective of narrating events with photographic precision, end quote. In your 2018 debate with Dr. Ehrman, you said that the Gospel's artistic and theological license to adapt their source material does not undermine their reliability as long as we understand that they were, quote, intended to give an accurate gist or essentially faithful representation of what occurred, end quote. So that's how you define historical reliability, and that's how you say ancient Greco-Roman historiographers conceived of reliability. So although the Gospels are not very accurate according to many modern standards, judging ancient literature by those standards is anachronistic. So is that a fair representation of your view?
Yeah, except when you say that, I would say that they're not very accurate by modern standards. I think that might be going a little too far. I like to illustrate it this way. There's a difference between a photograph and a portrait. So there's a photograph has actually survived of Abraham Lincoln delivering the Gettysburg Address. That gives us photographic accuracy, precise accuracy of what was going on at that very moment. Okay? Now, in contrast, we also have a portrait of George Washington, the first president of the United States. It shows him standing there, his hand is on his hip, which was something that an artist would portray on a person who had authority. And in the background, we see a battle going on. Now, we can be almost certain that George Washington, during the midst of combat, did not take some time out to sit for a portrait and have someone looking out like, incoming, with a cannonball. No, that's not what was going on there. What the portrait painter did was take Washington, put his hand on his hip in order to communicate an air of authority, had him in his general's uniform, had him painted a background in which a battle was going on. Why? Because it wanted to communicate more than a photograph. Of course, there were no photographs then, but it wanted to communicate something a photograph could not necessarily communicate. And that is that he was a great general who had won a war, a great war, had been in combat and things like that. So would we say that that portrait of Washington is inaccurate? No, I would say it's robustly accurate, but it is in the sense of not necessarily precision like we find in a photograph. It's like the kind we find in a portrait. Now, there's no perfect analogy here, but modern biographies are written more like photographs. Ancient biographies were written more like photographs, but they were like hybrids. They had some portrait elements in it. So if I had to take a guess, and again, this is just a rough guess, don't hold me to it, I'd say that like the synoptic gospels are more like 80-20, 80% or 90-10, 90% photograph, 10% portrait. Whereas the Gospel of John is maybe 70% photograph and 30% portrait. So when we say, is one robustly accurate or is one accurate, whereas the other is not historically reliable or accurate, I think that's kind of misleading of terms. So if we think, it's how we think of historical reliability. And this is why I think that recognizing genre is so important. We've got to ask the right questions. So for example, you would never ask the question, are the Psalms historically reliable? Well, no, they're not historically reliable, but they're not historically unreliable either. It's just to ask whether whether the Psalms are historically reliable it's the wrong question. It'd be like saying, um, does the color blue meet EPA standards? Or what's the square root of chicken? It's an incoherent thing. We have to ask the right question. And I think if you're going to expect the Gospels to follow modern literary conventions of photographic accuracy, you're going to be disappointed. But if you come to them and say, well, are they following the standards of accuracy of the first century and the surrounding centuries? Well, yeah, I think they do a pretty good job of it.
I think that's very helpful. The analogy, well, we're going to talk about some different analogies very soon, but the analogies of the portrait and the Psalms are really interesting. This reminds me of a debate that Dr. Craig Evans had with Dr. Bart Ehrman. And the way the debate question was phrased is, do the Gospels provide a historically reliable portrait of the historical Jesus? I'm thinking that Dr. Craig Evans kind of wanted to choose that because it's not a photo, it's not a detailed modern biography, it's a portrait. And then when Dr. Bart Ehrman asks him, sort of in the dialogue section, do you think that John is historically accurate? Do you think that Jesus said the I am sayings and he said all those discourses in John? He said it's kind of it's misguided to ask whether John is historically reliable because it's not trying to be. Do you agree that it's like the Psalms? It's inaccurate or misguided to even ask the question of is John reliable?
No, I think we can ask whether it's reliable, and as long as we're looking at it as a hybrid of photograph and portrait, then I think we're fine. I mean, even F.F. Bruce, who is very conservative, said he characterized John as taking the Jesus tradition and being an expanded paraphrase, a translation of the freest kind, a transposition into another key, and so much more. So even conservative New Testament scholars who have written on John, specialized in it, they recognize that there is Johannine adaptation. So is it accurate? Yeah, I think it's accurate. In some cases, it's more like a photograph, but in some cases, John is going to take some liberties, and it's going to be more like a portrait.
That's helpful. So let's go into some of these analogies again. You offer some analogies to kind of illustrate how, asking, are the Gospels reliable according to precise standards of accuracy? That question is misguided, and you talk about the message. The message, for anyone who doesn't know, it's a paraphrase of the Bible. It's gotten a lot of criticism for for being such a maybe loose paraphrase, but it's meant to convey. It doesn't even present itself as a sort of translation or a literal translation. It's meant to just be a paraphrase and to put the Bible in contemporary language. And then Titanic, the movie with Leonardo DiCaprio, to say, hey, the message is not reliable or Titanic is not reliable, it's to sort of miss the point because the message isn't trying to be reliable, or it's not trying to be very precise in its translation of the Bible. And the Titanic is meant to give a dramatized, entertaining retelling of a famous event. It's inspired by a true event. But so those are some analogies you give. But if I could give a little bit of pushback, if you are trying to uncover what the biblical authors originally wrote, then it does seem fair to say the message is not reliable, even though it gives a pretty accurate gist. Or, Titanic, if you're trying to figure out what happened to that massive ship in 1911, you wouldn't turn to Titanic. And so it seems like it could be reasonable to say Titanic is not robustly reliable, even though, it has the sinking of the ship in the right year and whatnot. So if we keep up the analogy with the Gospels, recognizing that the Gospels are not only meant to preserve history, with photographic precision, but also to encourage its audience to to share the gospel, to share theology, to be beautiful artistically. So if we keep up the analogy with the gospels and you're trying to figure out who the historical Jesus was, doesn't it seem, or it could be argued that it seems reasonable to say they're not robustly reliable, even though they preserve an accurate gist? So that was kind of a long-winded objection, but, what are your thoughts on that?
Let's talk about the Titanic movie first.
Sure.
For one, that's historical fiction. It's not even put forward as like a documentary or
Right.
trying to depict actual events, except the background of it occurring on the Titanic. So, yeah, that's not going to be. It's not even appropriate to ask whether it's historically reliable because it is historical fiction. And by the way, the Titanic sank, I think, in 1912, not 1911. So you
It
got
did.
that
Okay.
detail wrong. But that error, such an error, wouldn't mean that you're historically unreliable. It just meant that you could still be generally reliable, just not inerrant, right? So I think that's kind of an interesting thing. Now, when it comes to the message, yeah, the message is a paraphrase. It's meant to communicate the gist of what a verse is saying, what the text is saying. The purpose of a paraphrase is that you can sit down and read through it fairly quickly and just get an overall bird's eye view of what's being communicated. But it's not it's supposed to be for ease of reading, ease of comprehension. Whereas a translation, that's something you can dig into and hang on the words and phrases and really a lot of hermeneutical reflections on that. You just wouldn't do that with a paraphrase. So I wouldn't say that the message is unreliable. I mean, I've never read it. I've not attracted to paraphrases.
Me neither.
So I would say, generally speaking, it's probably a generally reliable representation of what the text says. Now, we also have to keep in mind that even the original Greek of the Gospels is probably much the same because Jesus probably spoke most of what he said that's reported in Aramaic and some in Hebrew, like when he's talking to Nicodemus. But the Gospels report it in Greek. So what kind of are they given a translation or are they given a paraphrase? I don't know. I mean, I think probably John is given a paraphrase in most cases, whereas perhaps the synoptic gospels are given a translation. So, in terms of reliable, we have to just be careful with how we're defining the term reliable. Again, I like the analogy of a photo versus a portrait. I just think that's probably one of the best ways of looking and talking about reliability. Let me say one more thing here. You mentioned my 2018 debate on the reliability of the Gospels with the Ehrman. A year after that, we had a panel discussion in Chicago. It was called the Defenders Conference, hosted by Veracity Hill and Dr. Kurt Jarris. And so you had Kurt and Rob Bowman and Bart Ehrman, Craig Keener, and myself on a panel at the end. And Bart and I got into it in terms of this. He was saying, well, yeah, I agree these compositional devices happen, but that means the Gospels are historically unreliable. And I said, well, I think you've got too much of a wooden understanding of what reliability is. And he basically said, well, Mike, the way you're positing it isn't how the average person in the pew would think about reliability. And I said, I agree with that. But here's the problem with that. What's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. And this applies not only to the Gospels, it applies to all ancient literature, biographies, and histories. So if the Gospels, by those standards that you're presenting, are historically reliable, so is every other biography of antiquity. And that is and he said, well, they are. They're historically unreliable, all of them. And I said, well, in that case, what does that communicate to the person in the pew? The people who aren't historians of this era. It communicates that we can know very little about the past because there are no sources that are historically unreliable. And that is mistaken. we can know a whole lot about people of the past. So I think it is up to you and I as historians who spend our lives in the texts, studying it and trying to understand the milieu in which they are written, the cultural and literary milieu in which they're written. It's up to us to clarify what we mean and to give a more sophisticated and nuanced definition of what we mean by historically reliable.
So I really appreciate that. Some people and some critics say that's kind of like lowering your standard of reliability. And I feel like you would disagree with that phrasing of it. It's adjusting it so that it's appropriate to a first century or even just ancient Greco-Roman historiographical context. So I don't think you would describe it as lowering the bar or lowering the standard of accuracy, would you?
No, I think you're right. I don't look at a portrait as being less accurate, but it's accurate in a different sense. It and I, sometimes in my lectures I'll show a photograph of me, and you see snow-filled mountains in the background, and you see me wearing one of those furry animal caps, well, like rabbit or whatever, but things here over, and what does this photograph communicate to you? Well, it communicates that, Mike, you're in a very cold place at that moment. What else does it communicate? Well, you got a smile on your face, so you're kind of happy. What else does it communicate? Well, nothing else. Well, the story is I was in Alaska. I had just preached at a service in a church on Sunday morning. Then they took me to this lake. It was 13 degrees below zero. I had a wool coat on, a thick wool commando sweater. I was layered. I had a scarf. I had a wool cap on, gloves, and I was shivering, be out of control, and it was very uncomfortable. And my friend Jimmy Stewart, yes, that's his real name, Jimmy Stewart, good friend of mine up there in Anchorage, he says, Mike, I got just the thing for you. And he went to his trunk and he grabbed this hat, and he says, put this on, this will help, because a lot of heat escapes from your head. I put it on, no, and within 5 minutes I started to sweat. And that's why I was smiling. I was feeling good at that point. But you wouldn't know all those through that. Now, a portrait is going to communicate a whole lot more than a photograph. It's not going to have photographic accuracy, but it is going to have other kind of accuracy, and it's going to give us a fuller account. So that's how we have to, we have to just understand it. If we are going to read the Gospels through the lens of a 21st century biographer, we're going to have a lot that is a little fuzzy. But when we look at the Gospels through the lens of first century biography, a lot more is going to come into focus.
That's great. I love that. So the analogy of the portrait, I think, just really illustrates your view. And a portrait involves, like you said, more than just photographic precision of what's kind of strictly occurring. And the Gospels, they're not just preserving, history. They're also, like I said, they're giving theology. I interviewed Dr. Craig Keener about the authenticity of the speeches in Acts, and he's like, you have to realize Luke was a great historian. He's I asked him like where Luke sort of lands in terms of how faithful he is to what was said. Is he kind of more loose like Tacitus and Josephus were, or does he stick closer to the substance of what was said, like Polybius or Thucydides? And he says he's closer to Thucydides and Polybius. So he was an accurate historian, but he was also a great rhetorician. Rhetorician? Yeah. Rhetorician. And he was a great theologian as well. He's Luke the theologian. So he has a Greek masterpiece. He has a theological treatise and a historical work. So when you look at the Gospels and Acts and Greco-Roman literature in general, you have to realize you're not just looking at a photograph or a kind of modern biography. There's history, there's art, there's literature, and there's theology. So I think you would agree
Yeah,
with that. I
it's
think
all in it.
yeah, and the vast majority of scholars agree with this. So my question, and I wasn't preparing to ask this, but how do you kind of navigate? And this is a whole question about methodology and historical Jesus studies and New Testament studies, but how do you navigate and balance the blend between history, theology, and art in the Gospels?
Well, sometimes we just can't know. We just can't know sometimes. I think we look at patterns. So sometimes we can look, and when I see Matthew and what he does with the Sermon on the Mount and where he puts the location, or what he does in the genealogies using gematria and seeing that he's not trying to be really precise with a lot of things, but he's trying to make an artistic representation of Jesus as the son of David, the Messiah, through his genealogy. It's like, oh, that's pretty cool. When you see these patterns that are happening, and then you see a difference, when you see a consistent kind of pattern in Matthew, what he's doing, then when a difference comes up, you say, all right, why is that difference there? I could see a possible theological flavoring that Matthew may have changed it for that reason. And then since he has a pattern, then I might be more inclined to think that Matthew changed it, altered the details a little bit in order to make a theological point. But a lot of times we're just not going to know. I do want to add one thing about the portrait thing. Sometimes I'll give this as an example because, when we talk about like the thing with George Washington, that is like somewhat radical diverging from a photograph. And most, what I'm saying, the hybrid kind of elements within the Gospels, I don't think for the most part, at least with John, where I think more of it's going on than any other Gospel. And in fact, I would say all scholars would agree with that. All Gospel scholars would agree with that. Even in John, you might have some of that really radical portrait stuff happening on occasion, but for the most part, the portrait stuff that we have are minor in their adaptations. So a modern example I might give is, let's say I take a photograph of a couple holding hands on a sunny day walking through a meadow of flowers. We think that's kind of neat. The photographer sees it. She snaps a photograph of it. She's got that. Now she takes that photograph back to her computer and does some editing on it. She makes the grass a little greener, or brings out the colors in a little brighter fashion, makes the sky a little bluer, and she casts this little haze over the whole thing, just a slight blur and haze over it. And if you can imagine that, it would just create an amazing romantic element to that photograph. In fact, looking at that photograph in that sense would communicate more than just the photograph that's untouched. You could, because of that little haze and the brighter colors, you could see that couple holding hands and actually almost kind of experience some of the butterflies they had in their stomach as they were walking hand in hand through the meadow on that beautiful day. That's something you don't necessarily get in a photograph. So the portrait communicates more information. It communicates accurate stuff that a photograph doesn't. But notice that both of them are still very similar. It's just that the photograph, the original one, has been doctored up a little bit in order to communicate additional truths.
So the doctored photograph, as well as the Gospels, give an essentially faithful representation of what occurred, but with either literary or theological flavoring. In your debate with Dr. Dennis MacDonald, he mentioned Homeric parallels, potential imitation of the Gospels with Homeric epics and other Greek and Roman literature, and you said it's historical at its core with Homeric flavoring. And similarly, the photograph, it preserves an essentially faithful representation of what occurred, but it's edited to kind of bring out the emotions of it. And this, I guess, leads me to my final question. And this is, again, about the implications of your view. So you say that the evangelists did not invent entire implausible events. Their adaptations were quite restrained compared to other Greco-Roman writers. They would paraphrase logia or sayings, substitute synonymous phrases, adapt details such as location or chronology, the first two examples we looked at the beginning of this video, sometimes compose speeches consistent with the figure's character, and so on. On your view, the evangelists provide a basically accurate gist colored by artistic, literary, and theological features. But the implication seems to be, or an implication seems to be, that history-conscious Christians cannot be confident in many details. For example, they can have confidence that Jesus was regarded as an exorcist, but they can't know if any one of Jesus' specific interactions with demoniacs is trustworthy. Or they can know that Jesus gave many great sayings, and they can have confidence in some of them, but they couldn't appeal to, the Great Commission or something like that, where they say, remember how Jesus said, because it could have been an evangelistic extrapolation or expansion or paraphrase or something like that. So do you agree that a kind of Christian need to avoid details is an implication? And if so, is this troubling in any way? Or would you say maybe it's just a fact of the gospel genre that we have to accept whether we like it or not?
I think that might be going a
little too far?
further than maybe a little further than I would go. Let's take, for example, what the difference between Matthew and Mark's accounts of Jesus cleansing the temple and cursing the fig tree. So Mark gives us probably more of like what things actually occurred. He has Jesus go into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. He goes into the temple and looks around. Doesn't do anything because it's late in the day. So he just looks around. Then they leave. And Sunday night, they go to Bethany and they spend the night there. Monday morning, they get up. They're headed back to Jerusalem. Jesus comes across this fig tree. It has no figs on it, so he curses it. Then they go into the city, and it's Monday when Jesus cleanses the temple. This is still Mark, of course. He cleanses the temple on Monday. Afterward, they head back to Bethany. They spend Monday night in Bethany. Tuesday morning, they get up. They're headed back to Jerusalem, and they come across the fig tree Jesus cursed on Monday. And Peter says, "Look, Lord, the tree that you cursed is withered and died." So you've got two visits to the temple and two encounters with the fig tree. One in which he curses it. The second one, they notice that it's dried and died. Matthew is going to give us the guy version of the story. He's going to compress and conflate things. So Palm Sunday, Matthew narrates Jesus going into Jerusalem, Palm Sunday. He goes into the temple, and now he's going to conflate the two visits into one, and has Jesus cleanse the temple on Sunday. Then they leave. They go spend the night in Bethany. Monday morning, they head back to Jerusalem. Jesus comes to the tree. There's no figs on it, so he curses it, and immediately it withers. So there's no two visits to the tomb or to the temple. It's only one. There's no two parts to the fig tree. There's only one. So that doesn't mean that we can't be certain or we can't be confident that Jesus cleansed the temple or cursed the fig tree. It just means that Matthew is doing some of these things that were prescribed in the compositional textbooks and that we see Plutarch and other ancient biographers doing. He's just simplifying his account. Kind of things that a lot of people do even today in our ordinary, everyday conversations. Do I find this kind of move on Matthew's part troubling? Or do I find the kind of move on John's part troubling? What if, and scholars talk about whether Jesus actually made the I am statements in John. No, I don't know. I think I'm going to be like Raymond Brown here and say I don't know, and I don't think we can know. But I think it is interesting that he doesn't really make these kinds of statements, at least not with the regularity we find them in John's gospel. But what we do find is that Jesus, every single one of the I am statements that Jesus makes in John, you have the synoptic gospels have Jesus say or do something that implies the same thing in the synoptics. So did Jesus say, I am the way, the truth, and the life? No one comes to the Father but by me? I don't know. But you have Matthew and Luke illustrated. He says the same thing when he says, no one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and to whomever the Son wills to reveal him. That's the same thing. No one comes to the Father except through me. So it's the same kind of message. Did Jesus say before Abraham was, I am? I don't know. But the Gospels, even Mark, clearly portrayed Jesus as being God's uniquely divine Son. So he's communicating the same kinds of stuff. It's just not in the same way. So this used to trouble me in the very beginning. This troubled me. And it's because I wanted to look. For years, I looked at the Gospels as though they were photographs. In fact, it was so much so that I remember when I was learning Greek, my very first semester, I'm reading the Gospels and pronouncing what Jesus said, and I'm thinking, wow, this is so cool. The way I'm pronouncing here is just how Jesus said when he said it. So naive was I, because Jesus probably didn't speak that in Greek. He spoke it in Aramaic, and we're reading a Greek translation. Doesn't mean that it's unreliable, but it means I had this very wooden, literal view of things. And now, as I've come to recognize that's not what we have with the Gospels, it doesn't trouble me. I've become used to it. And my expectations are different. Do I think the Gospels are accurate? Yes. Partially in a photographic sense, partially in a portrait sense. I don't look at them as pure photographic sense anymore. And if we do, that's what brings discomfort. Now, I know that some people have been reticent to be able to accept this kind of stuff, but the fact is that the Gospels are as God intended. And if we truly want to have a high view of Scripture, then we must accept Scripture, including the Gospels, as God has given them to us, rather than insisting that they conform to a model of how we think he should have. And if we neglect to do this, we may claim to have a high view of Scripture, but in reality, all we have is a high view of our view of Scripture.
You mentioned how your perspective has kind of changed. We're coming to the conclusion of this video, and I want to ask you more about that. But just this is my final major question, or that was my final major question, and I would just want to clarify when it comes to the details in the Gospels and when it comes to specific sayings or deeds of Jesus, while they're not recorded verbatim, or at least we can't know if they're recorded verbatim, or if we can affirm with historical confidence, Jesus said this, and that, or John 14, verse 6. When we read the Gospels, we're still seeing Jesus. We're still seeing a portrait of Jesus. So even the details in the Gospels about the historical Jesus tell us about the historical Jesus with accuracy, just not in the sense that most of us are familiar with. Is that fair?
Yeah, I would say that's correct. And I would only clarify by saying, as I said earlier, some things have more evidence to confirm them than others.
Right.
So, for example, Jesus walking on water and feeding the 5,000 are reported in all four Gospels. And even if we say, well, Luke and Matthew are relying on Mark as their primary source, it's still in Mark and it's in John. And scholars, although they disagree on whether John knew of Mark's Gospel, they still are virtually unanimous, not completely unanimous, but virtually, that John is writing entirely independent. He's an independent source of Mark. And so Jesus feeding the 5,000 and walking on water is one of the best attested miracles or even events, acts of Jesus. And so, yeah, I think that's the case. But then there are some things like the raising of Lazarus from the dead, or raising of the widow's son. The widow's son is only attested in Luke. The raising of Lazarus from the dead is only attested in John. Do I believe these happened? Yeah. But I can't have the same kind of historical confidence in them as I can in things that are multiply attested or attested in multiple independent sources that are rooted in eyewitness testimony. Um, so that's what I would mean by that.
Yeah, there are degrees of probability for sure. I'm reading Dr. John Dominic Crossan's book, Jesus, A Revolutionary Biography. And I mentioned this to illustrate that recognizing literary adaptation and theological adaptation doesn't mean you have to reject everything. You can, there's a whole spectrum. Most scholars agree that there is preservation of historical tradition as well as adaptation. And you can come on the more conservative side, such as Dr. Licona and Dr. Evans, or you can come on the more liberal side, such as Dr. Crossan. And this recognizing compositional devices doesn't force you to one way or the other. It's just recognizing a fact, and then you can explore a lot from there. And what this is bringing, yeah.
Recognizing compositional devices doesn't force you to one way or the other toward reliability or unreliability. But I'll tell you what I do think they do is they take the big card away from the hand of the person who wants to say that these differences mean that the Gospels are historically unreliable. Recognizing the compositional devices doesn't make them reliable. You still have to argue for the and provide reasons for thinking the Gospels are historically reliable, which I've done elsewhere. But recognizing compositional devices and as a major reason for most of the differences in the Gospels, I do think takes away the major objection to the reliability of the Gospels.
Yeah, and that's why I value this section of your work so much. And one more thing on a more spiritual level, maybe, Dallas Willard talks about, the renovation of the heart, right? And he defines that. I don't want to botch it because he's great, but he talks about apprenticeship to Jesus, right? And being conformed to the character and teachings of Jesus. So someone focused on the renovation of their heart, if they hear about compositional devices and they hear, wait, did Jesus say, I am the truth, I am the way, the truth, and the life, or did he say specific things? This could be maybe disconcerting to them. But you would say, no, when you see the Gospels, you're still seeing a faithful representation of what occurred. You're still seeing a portrait of the historical Jesus. But it's not precise. It's not photographically precise history. It's history with theology, with literary features. Is that right?
Yeah, I'd say so. And more adaptation within John than we have in the Synoptic Gospels.
All right. Well, we're coming to the conclusion of the video, and with every guest, I ask the same 3 questions to wrap it up. So first, what's one significant, or it could be several, but what's something significant you've changed your mind on? It could be about Gospels, or about the resurrection, or Jesus, or just anything.
Well, I have changed my view on what I'm reading when I'm reading the Gospels. I no longer view them as precise snapshots of Jesus. I view them as more like snapshots with some, a hybrid of some portrait elements in it, especially in John, but also some within the Synoptic Gospels.
All right, and then we've been talking about very scholarly things. So maybe what's something more personal that influences how you view reality? Something that doesn't constitute propositional evidence, but it affects your worldview.
Doesn't constitute propositional evidence. So I'm guessing you're saying don't include anything from your research here. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so maybe conversations you've had, or family, or culture, or things like that.
Well, of course, all of that really influences our worldview, or what a lot of historians refer to as their horizons. It's our race, gender, ethics, nationality, our political, religious, philosophical convictions, the way we were raised, the academic institutions we attended, and the group of people whose respect we desire. All of these influence the way we look at things, and why a lot of us can look at the same data and arrive at different conclusions. When I'm doing my historical work, I really try not to allow my horizon to influence that. Now, of course, it's going to, but I try to minimize that, and I take specific steps toward doing that. So, yeah, my horizon is going to creep in there, but to be honest with you, I try not to let it. So, when we talk about the Gospels and, what we can confirm and not, I try not to allow my belief that scriptures are divinely inspired to influence my historical work on that. And I try to be open to other things. I'll give you an example. Just yesterday, talking to one of my students at Houston Christian University, which, by the way, is a great university. We have a fantastic Master of Arts degree in Christian apologetics. If you want to know more about it, go to hc.edu/defend. There's my shameless plug for my school. So I was talking to one of my students yesterday, and they were talking about Sodom and Gomorrah and how some people, skeptics, will say it was an asteroid that destroyed those cities. And so you don't need God for it. And I thought to myself, well, that's correct. You don't need God for that. An asteroid could have done it, and it's entirely possible, plausible, that the biblical writer took that actual historical event and wrote in some theological significance and interpreted it as God destroying the city, and made up some stuff along the way about God communicating with Abraham that he was going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. It's entirely plausible. As a number of Old Testament scholars, evangelicals, have told me, once you get past, go before the time of King David, there's a lot of stuff for which we just don't have evidence in the Old Testament. So the bottom line is, if I'm working as a historian, I have to say that is possible. And I have to say, but it still could be God. It may have been that if there was an asteroid that destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, it could be that that's how God did it to the city. He destroyed it in that sense. It doesn't negate that God did it. It just might show that could have been the means by which he did it. That would be one of those things for the Old Testament that I would say, well, I might believe that God did it, but I can't establish that God did it. It's just beyond what the tools of historians are. And when I'm looking at it as a historian, I'm trying to be as fair-minded and neutral as possible. But I want to add this, that when you come to the resurrection of Jesus, and I've done that, it's really cool to see that even approaching the question of Jesus' resurrection as open and trying to be as fair-minded as possible, to see that the evidence still points strongly to the conclusion that the resurrection of Jesus actually occurred. It was an event that occurred in history. That's pretty cool when you can come to the text and try to treat it as fair and unbiased as possible, and still see that the evidence points very conclusively to Jesus rising from the dead.
I've spoken with Dr. Sean McDowell a lot, and one thing he often says he pretty much always says when he mentions you is that he respects how kind of fairly you approach the evidence, and how you, although you're an evangelical Christian apologist, he respects how well you minimize your biases when you're doing historical work, and then you come to your conclusions and then you share those. So I respect that too. And my final question is just any final thoughts, anything you want to leave me or other truth seekers with, or resources you would recommend to our audience?
Sure. Well, I'll throw back a compliment, a very well-deserved compliment to Sean, and say, I was the external reader for his doctoral dissertation, which was on the fate of the apostles. I think it's the best treatment of that ever written. And anyone who's really interested in a sober-minded investigation of what happened to the apostles, look no further than Sean McDowell's book. I also want to tip my hat to you, Nahoa, and say this has been a very delightful interview. I'm impressed with you, my friend. You ask some very, very thoughtful questions, more so than most interviewers. So congratulations, and great job. So, we've talked about a lot of things like gospel differences and what we can affirm historically with confidence. I think the resurrection is one of those things. I've studied the stuff about the resurrection of Jesus for more than 25 years. And the more I've had 36 debates, the very large majority of them, public debates, have been on the resurrection of Jesus. And I can say that these only serve to strengthen my faith in the resurrection, because I see what kind of answers skeptics give, and I don't find them persuasive at all. I think they're quite weak. And so when you see what some of these leading scholars are using as arguments against the resurrection, saying that's it, that's all they have, I think we've got some good evidence. And no matter where you land on the issue of accounting for gospel differences, or how reliable you think the gospels are, how you define historically reliable, bottom line is this: if Jesus rose from the dead, it's game, set, match. Christianity is true, period. So even if the Old Testament biblical text is wrong about God commanding the Israelites to do the genocide of the Old Testament, kill the men, women, children, and animals of various peoples, if that was just merely a worst case scenario, the political propaganda meant to justify the acts of a brutal Israelite king, if Jesus rose from the dead, Christianity is still true. It would just mean that, that's just something about the Bible that we're not going to like or accept as being from God, in terms of that genocide text in the Old Testament. I'm not saying that's what it is. I'm just saying worst case scenario, even if that were the case, Christianity is still true if Jesus rose. If a lot of things in the Old Testament, some of the things in the New Testament are false, if Jesus rose, Christianity is true. And so I like to major on the majors. And the resurrection of Jesus gives us such a thing. And so tomorrow is Good Friday. And as my friend Frank Turek has said, if Jesus wasn't raised on Sunday, Good Friday was just another Friday. But he rose. The evidence points to the resurrection of Jesus, and that gives me a lot of hope. It means that God cares for me. It means that Jesus lives, and because he lives and promises me eternal life, I can have the hope of eternal life. I can have the hope of seeing my loved ones again. I can have the hope that this life isn't the end of things, and that no matter how bad things get in this life, and they will get bad for every one of us at some point or another, this life is just temporal, and we can make it through it. God will be with us, and it's a molding ground to confirm us more to the image of Christ, and we can have eternal life. And that's what excites me about the resurrection of Jesus.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I appreciate everything you said just now and throughout the interview, even just agreeing to have this discussion with me. It's been awesome. I'll let Dr. McDowell know about your compliments, and I appreciate yours toward me. To our audience, I can have a bunch of resources in the description. Dr. Licona's book on the resurrection and his book on gospel differences, links to his debates I've watched. Honestly, I counted over a dozen hours of his debates, including one where he debated Dr. Bart Ehrman for 7 hours. I can put a link to that as well. I was there live. I was watching it. I'm a fan of Dr. Licona, and I appreciate you. I appreciate everyone. So with that, peace.